Ever get that feeling, like when you just know someone's about to call and then bam, the phone rings? Today we're diving into a whole research paper that looked at those kinds of experiences, the world of ESP, but specifically with these Ganzfeld experiments.
It's wild though, right? Because these researchers weren't messing around with just spooky stories or whatever. They were analyzing decades of controlled experiments. They wanted to see, is there any actual scientific basis to this whole idea of extrasensory perception?
Okay, so we're talking hardcore data here, not just vibes.
Oh, yeah.
So for this deep dive, you sent over this paper just titled Parapsychology. Tell me about it.
This paper was a pretty big deal, actually, when it came out. It was by Monica J. Harris and Robert Rosenthal, Harvard folks, no less. And they got it published in the Journal of Anomalous Experience and Cognition back in 2004.
Okay, Harvard legit. This is already feeling less like, tinfoil hat territory.
Right. Like, this is serious stuff. And get this. Harris and Rosenthal were originally commissioned by the National Research Council. They were looking into human enhancement.
So, how to improve our abilities. I'm with them so far.
Exactly. And they dug into tons of existing research on 5 different areas. But one of them, yeah, you guessed it, was these Ganzfeld experiments in parapsychology.
Which would be a huge deal if you could prove it, right? Talk about human enhancement. Okay, but for those of us who haven't spent our weekends, attempting telepathy, what even is a Ganzfeld experiment?
So picture this. You're in a room, everything's white, or maybe bathed in this soft pink light. You've got headphones on with just white noise playing. The whole point is to block out as much external sensory input as possible. You're basically a blank mental slate.
Okay, I'm starting to see why that might be relevant here. You're trying to quiet down all the everyday noise of the world so maybe you can hear those more subtle psychic signals.
Exactly. And in a typical Ganzfeld experiment, you've got a sender who's trying to transmit specific images or thoughts, and then you've got a receiver in that sensory-deprived state, and you see if they pick up on anything. So what Harris and Rosenthal did, their paper was what we call a meta-analysis of these experiments. They looked at a whole bunch of them to see if there were any larger trends.
And I'm hearing you say they found something interesting. Right. I mean, we wouldn't be talking about this paper if it just said, nope, ESP is a bust.
You're catching on. So they really honed in on 28 studies. These all use something called the direct hits method, meaning the receiver had to pick the exact target the sender was trying to send, no partial credit or anything.
So if there were 4 possible images, just guessing randomly would get you a hit 25% of the time.
Exactly. 1 in 4. So to see if those studies were showing anything beyond random chance, they used this statistical measure called Cohen's H. It's basically a way to see how strong the evidence is for an actual effect, in this case ESP, rather than just lucky guesses.
Okay, so what this Cohen's ache thing tell them? Was there something statistically interesting going on in those Ganzfeld experiments?
So their analysis, it actually showed a statistically significant effect, meaning it's pretty unlikely the results they were seeing were just random chance, way less likely than you'd expect. In fact, while you normally expect that 1 in 4 hit rate just from pure guessing, they found that the actual accuracy was closer to 1 in 3 across those 28 studies.
Okay, I can see why some folks might be raising their eyebrows at this point. A 1 in 4 chance versus a 1 in 3 chance, that's a pretty big jump when we're talking about ESP here.
Oh, yeah. Now, it's important to remember, even Harris and Rosenthal themselves, they were skeptical at first. They didn't go into this expecting, to find proof of ESP. They were actually super meticulous in trying to rule out other explanations for their findings.
So they were like, let's try to poke holes in our own research before anyone else can.
Exactly. And this is where their work gets even cooler, honestly. They didn't just look at the overall results. They actually dug into each individual experiment, hunting for any flaws that might have messed with the results.
That makes sense, right? If those experiments weren't done super carefully, the whole thing kind of falls apart. What kind of flaws were they even looking for?
Oh, everything you can imagine. Inconsistencies in the procedures, potential biases from the experimenters, even the possibility that some of the receivers were accidentally getting clues from the environment. They analyzed everything, trying to see if these flaws correlated with the success rates of the experiments. And get this.
All right, you're killing me. What'd they find?
They found that even after you account for all those potential problems, that statistically significant effect, it was still there. In their own words, the flaws didn't really impact the outcome in a major way.
Wow. So even when they tried to debunk their own findings, this possibility of ESP was still staring them right in the face. I can only imagine what was going through their minds at that point.
Right. Imagine being a scientist. Your whole life is about data, logic, and then you stumble onto something that challenges everything you thought you knew about the world.
And I'm guessing that's where things got really interesting, not just scientifically, but maybe even professionally. Like publishing a paper that suggests ESP might be real, that's bound to ruffle some feathers.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that is exactly where we're headed next. Oh, absolutely. And that is exactly where things got really interesting. So remember how their research was actually part of this bigger project for the National Research Council?
Right.
Well, apparently when they submitted their report, it caused quite a stir.
Oh, I bet. So what, were people freaking out? Like who was pushing back? Other scientists? Government types? This sounds like, I don't know, some X-Files stuff.
Well, we can do a whole other deep dive on the politics of scientific research sometime, you know?
Note to self.
But it seems like there were definitely some concerns about what these findings might mean, if they got out. However, Harris and Rosenthal, they weren't having it. They stood by their data, their analysis, the whole 9 yards.
Good for them. It takes guts to stand up for what you believe in, especially when you're going against the grain like that.
Totally.
Yeah.
And you know what? Their commitment to actually doing good science, that's what let this research even see the light of day. Because get this, they'd already given the editor over at the Journal of Anomalous Experience and Cognition permission to publish their paper, no matter what happened with that NRC report.
So that paper we're looking at now, that's like the uncensored version of their findings.
Exactly. Uncut, unfiltered. It's honestly kind of a time capsule, right? A peek into this moment in scientific history when you had these really controversial findings, people trying to bury them, and these researchers were like, nope, transparency is key.
Love it. Okay, so the paper's out there. What happened? Did it blow up? Did it start, a huge debate, or was it more of a slow burn?
Oh, it definitely sparks some fireworks, let me tell you. I mean, imagine you're presenting evidence that challenges one of the fundamental ideas of modern science. That our minds are basically stuck inside our brains, that our senses are the only way we experience the world.
Right. It's like saying, hey, what if there's this whole other layer of reality we're just not equipped to see?
Exactly. It makes you question everything. And this is where it gets even more interesting, I think, because it shows how science actually works. You had some researchers who were totally fascinated by what Harris and Rosenthal found. They were like, this is huge. We need to study this more.
Okay, so one group is like, more research, please. What about the other side? Were they convinced?
Not so much. I mean, there was definitely a good deal of skepticism, which makes sense, right? Some researchers questioned the whole methodology of the Ganzfeld experiments, saying they were too open to bias, experimental error, all that.
They're saying, hold on, there might be another explanation here.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Like maybe it's not ESP, but something else is going on. And they would point out, how hard it is to replicate these findings consistently, which is a big deal in science. It's not enough if one study shows something. Others need to be able to repeat the experiment and get similar results for it to really hold water.
Replicability, for sure. But even if it's tricky to replicate exactly, doesn't the fact that those results exist at all and that they were statistically significant mean something?
Absolutely. And that's the heart of it, right?
Yeah.
Even now, all these years later, the scientific community is still wrestling with this whole thing. What does it mean?
It's like they opened this door to a whole world of what ifs, and we're still trying to figure out what's on the other side.
Perfectly put. And that's what I love about this topic. It pushes us, to really look at the limits of what we know, to grapple with these big questions that don't have easy answers.
Okay, so we've got this debate raging on, good points on both sides, but where do Harris and Rosenthal themselves land on this? Did they go full ESP believer, or were they more cautious?
That's such a good question, and I think it speaks to how seriously they took their work. They were incredibly careful in their analysis, and even though their findings pointed towards this, potential phenomenon, they didn't jump to any conclusions.
So no, we've discovered ESP, everyone.
No, not at all. They actually emphasize how important it is to keep researching, keep doing experiments, and to stay skeptical.
They're like, we found something cool, but don't rewrite the textbooks just yet.
Exactly. They weren't afraid of the implications of what they found, but they also knew that studying something like ESP is complex. You got to be humble.
Which honestly makes their findings even more interesting, right?
Oh, totally. It's one thing to have a hunch, but to do the work, analyze the data, try to disprove yourself, and still come out saying, hey, there might be something here. That's huge.
Okay, so we've established this research was a really big deal. It's still sparking debate. But what does this all mean for, the average person listening? Why should they care about a bunch of experiments from decades ago?
That is the million-dollar question, and that is where we're headed next.
That is the million-dollar question, and that is where we're headed next. So, what's the takeaway for the average person who's like, okay, cool ESP research, but what does this have to do with me?
Totally. It's like we usually go through life thinking about the world in terms of what we can see, hear, touch, right? But what if, and this is what Harris and Rosenthal's work makes you think about, what if our senses are just scratching the surface? What if there's way more to reality than we even realize?
It's kind of a mind-blowing idea when you really think about it. Like, what if there are all these layers of experience we're totally missing out on?
Right. It makes you realize just how limited our understanding of, well, everything might be. Like, what if we've barely scratched the surface of consciousness itself?
Okay, so let's say there's something to this whole ESP thing. What are the implications? Where does it lead us?
Well, for one thing, it makes you wonder about, what we're all really capable of. If ESP is real, if we can tap into information beyond our five senses, that's a game changer.
Right. It's like we've all got this untapped potential just waiting to be unlocked.
Exactly. And it's not just about, individual abilities either. Think about communication. What if we could get past language altogether? Connect mind to mind.
Okay, now that's straight out of sci-fi. But also, really cool to think about. So where does all this leave us? What's the takeaway for all the curious listeners out there hanging on our every word, fascinated by this research just as much as I am?
Well, if nothing else, I think this research reminds us that there's still so much we don't know. The world is full of mysteries, and science can be this incredible tool to help us make sense of it all, even the really weird stuff.
It's like a reminder to stay curious, right? Don't take anything for granted. Question everything. Who knows what's out there waiting to be discovered?
100%. And that's what Harris and Rosenthal were all about. They were trying to prove ESP. They were just following the data wherever it led. And they ended up opening up this whole avenue of research that people are still exploring today. The point isn't to blindly believe. It's to ask questions, be skeptical, but also be open-minded.
So the debate about ESP might not be settled, but at least it gets people talking, right? It gets us thinking.
Exactly. It reminds us that there's always more to learn, always more to explore. And sometimes the most interesting questions are the ones without easy answers.
And on that note, I think we'll wrap things up here. But for everyone listening, remember, what if the most incredible discoveries about ourselves and the universe are still ahead of us? What if the things we think are impossible are just waiting for us to catch up? Until next time, stay curious, keep questioning, and as always, keep diving deep.